Hey everyone, and welcome to another sponsored Risky Business product demo. My name's Patrick Gray. And in this demo, we're going to be taking a fresh look at the runZero platform. Many of you would remember runZero as an asset discovery tool. Started off as a network scanner. You cut it loose on your network. It goes and tells you what's out there. Really accurate fingerprinting. Then it grew. You could start plugging, cloud information into it, so you could get an inventory of what's running in your cloud tenants. And then, hey, we've got some EDR information over here. Why don't we plug it into that and bring that information in? So really runZero has just sort of become this thing where you can just see everything across your environment, on-prem and cloud. But the really big news is that now runZero is making a play for the vulnerability management market. Okay, so it's runZero's position, and it's one that I happen to agree with, which is that the incumbent vulnerability scanners are just not very good these days. I mean, they've got their endpoint agents and whatnot, but once you actually start, trying to do scans over the network, it's all of these authenticated scans, and they're just not very good. And the whole thing's just a bit of a mess, basically. So runZero has really innovated there. And what you're going to see is a demo of the platform doing, discovery and then vulnerability scanning. And yeah, it's extremely cool. So Ali Cheikh from runZero joined me to demo the product, but I'll drop you in here where he is talking a little bit about why runZero has made this move into the vulnerability management market. Here he is.
The industry is agreeing more and more that traditional way of doing vulnerability management is broken. Not every exposure or vulnerability has a CVE, and not every critical CVE must be remediated, especially if you don't have context. And a lot of customers that we talk to, they have an overload of information, and the amount of false positive that they have to deal with is insane. So in 2024 alone, there was over 40,000 CVEs that were disclosed, and only 1% of those were actually actively exploited in the wild. So how can you make sense of all of that noise and prioritize that vulnerabilities when you have that insane amount of data? So context becomes very critical. How can you get context if you don't even know what you have? And unfortunately, many traditional platforms or existing security platforms are not giving you that context, whether it's network context, like, is this asset connected to the network? Is it internal? Business context, how important is that asset to the overall business? Or even asset context, like, no more generic Linux, no more generic MacBook. I want to know what is the makeshift of that asset.
Yeah, and I guess, if runZero can find it, and runZero can prove that a vulnerability exists on this thing that it can find, it means attackers can find it too, right? So it's like, very first principles kind of stuff. All right, let's get into the demo now. What's the first thing you're going to show us?
Yeah, so we'll start with the most important thing, which is visibility. So that foundational layer that any security program needs. If you don't know what you have, how can you protect it? And runZero has the best combination of solution approaches in the market in terms of collecting insight and data about your assets and your attack surface. And we have essentially three main approaches that runZero employs. If you kind of look onto the top left where it says data sources, the first thing is our unauthenticated active scanner. And that's a proprietary scanner that is insanely accurate and safe across all different types of networks, especially ones that have fragile devices such as, OT, ICS environment. And we're not leveraging any credentials. So the scanner actually uses unauthenticated, and it scans across your internal infrastructure and external attack surface. And the benefit is that because you're not providing us any credentials, we do a very good job of finding unmanaged and devices that cannot be managed. And of course, in security, we all know if you use credentials, you're pretty much spraying that across the network, which is a big no-no in security.
In fact, your founder, HD Moore, is very funny about that, like in just conversations I've had with him, which is like, yeah, great idea for these vuln scanners. Just give them highly privileged creds and just spray them around on the network. That'll be fine, right? So yeah, this doesn't do that, which is nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the second method is our passive traffic sampling. And this is not your typical passive network discovery that requires, a hardware appliance to be shipped to your data center or an insane amount of resources. What's great about this is it actually can be used as a way to provide an always-on discovery, continuously listening to the traffic to support our active scanner, and also in environments where, active scanning is still not comfortable with it, especially OT and ICS. So you can leverage the passive discovery as well.
What's really funny about that is that I know how much work went into making your active discovery extremely safe to use in like OT environments, but then people are still like, no, we want passive, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
that's how runZero's wound up with having, there's the passive versus active war, and runZero has solved that problem by just having both.
Yeah, and it's definitely is changing the mind of a lot of people. I think the industry is becoming more and more comfortable with active scanning. And there are a lot of examples that we have with industries such as energy, automotive, that are using runZero in the manufacturing floor to scan those OT devices. But again, having the possibility for the passive still makes a lot of people comfortable, I think.
Well, it's historical. There were scanners back in the day that would knock stuff over, right? So there's reasons why people are sketchy about it, but yeah, cool. Anyway, I am interrupting you. Please continue.
No worries. And then finally, we have API integrations. I think this is pretty straightforward. It's us integrating with existing platforms and existing solutions that you have in order to ingest that and merge them with what was discovered by the runZero scanner, but also the passive discovery. As you can see here on the list, we'll integrate with cloud service providers, vulnerability management, EDR, MDM, etc., even other OT vendors. And the benefit is being able to get additional enrichment, such as what softwares are running on the asset, metadata such as tags, users, group, etc., etc. And I want to point out really quick before we move on from API integration, this custom integration that you see. This is the capability of allowing a customer to essentially integrate with a tool that is not part of the named integrations that we support. We have a lot of customers that actually build custom integration with their own custom in-house built platforms to enrich asset data into runZero. And then the last method is air-gapped environment, because I think that's an overlooked type of networks. And we need to make sure that we're able to cover all different use cases that customers bring. And we offer an offline scanner that is completely disconnected from the rest of the runZero platform. And it serves those edge use cases where you have maybe networks completely disconnected, especially in OT and critical infrastructure. So the multitude of approach that we just talked about, again, doesn't leverage agents. It's not authentication at all, and doesn't require physical appliance to be deployed. And what ties all of this together is our fingerprinting approach, which is a research-based fingerprinting that accurately identifies the makeshift in an asset. And we have a dedicated research team that actually focuses on continuously improving the way to identify those assets across your internal, external cloud attack.
Yeah, if something weird starts popping up in customer data, your research team can go, okay, what is that? And then figure it out.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely, 100%. The culmination of approaches that runZero offers allows us to gather critical insights about your network and your assets, specifically what services are running on that IP address, what software is installed on that asset, and essentially what's the network hygiene. And we're not just a data aggregator. I think we made that very clear. We have our own authenticated scanner that goes and essentially shines a light on your network and tell you a lot of metadata that is missing from traditional CASM attack surface management tools. And we merge the data together, and you'll see here a couple of examples where if you look at the sources column, runZero has discovered it with our scanner, but we've also found that same asset in CrowdStrike. It is running a Tenable Nessus scanner, but also joined to the domain, so it has an Azure Active Directory dataset. And the importance of merging the data is a critical aspect of runZero. We don't want to be showing you that asset completely duplicated, and we do a very good job of essentially merging all of those together.
Which is harder than people who are watching this may think. Actually,
yeah.
Deduplicating data sets like this is super hard. So the fact that you're able to do that is, impressive.
Yeah. And I was going to show just a few types of devices, because we talked obviously about, covering IT, OT, and IoT. And this is an example of an IT typical server. And if I click on it, it shows me the details of that asset. You can see all of the metadata that we collected from the third-party integration, but also what has runZero scanned on the network for that server. And the important thing to note here is the level of details that we are providing is unmatched when it comes to attack surface management. We are telling you additional data sets such as, what is the TCP IP stack, ownership of the asset, which we'll talk in more details in a bit, what are some of the vulnerabilities that we found, software installed on an asset, and then finally protocols, services, and ports, which allows us to get that additional insight around exposure. And we'll talk about that in more details. But it's very important to have that information in order to prioritize risk and obviously be able to say, hey, I understand what exists on my network, and I can show you that in a very clean and kind of precise way.
Well, and of course, once you've got all of this data in one place too, you can query it, show me devices that have CrowdStrike but not Nessus, or devices that have Nessus but not CrowdStrike. And, you can start to find those outliers and whatever. And that was really the bread and butter of runZero before you added all of this fancy stuff that we're gonna demo today.
Yeah, exactly. And that you hit the nail on the head there, Patrick. So I talk to our customers and I say, this is your Google search of your attack surface. The amount of customization you can do from a career perspective is very, very impressive. And from an OT perspective, I have a few examples here in the demo data. And this, I think, is a very important aspect of security, especially if a customer has OT devices. And they typically struggle with having a representation of what OT devices exist in the environment, because you cannot manage OT devices with other security platforms. They're not, a lot of them you cannot authenticate to or deploy an agent. So what ends up happening is you use an Excel sheet or a passive discovery, which has its own limitation. And runZero a lot of times become that source of truth for OT devices because we're able to scan them safely. And the level of details that we're showing is the same thing with IT devices. And I was going to show this this asset right here, which is a PDU Raritan. And the same level of details that I've shown for the IT is also represented here for OT. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, you'll have third-party tools that are trying to discover it. And this is the data set coming from Qualys, Patrick. And as you can see here, it just says Linux, literally. It doesn't show us any additional details about it. So
that's helpful. Thanks, Qualys.
Exactly. So from a prioritization perspective, if you don't have that visibility, Linux is not the same thing as actually having an OT device. So that additional details that runZero provide is very, very important. In last month, CISA in the US, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, actually released a guidance with the collaboration of different international entities, including actually the Australian Cybersecurity Center, on the importance of having an OT asset inventory. It provides a very clear guideline and framework, and it's calling a lot of the asset attributes that need to be part of the inventory, the attributes that we're showing here in the demo. So runZero can help with that and kind of turn the guidance into something tangible.
Well, I mean, I covered that in the main show. I covered the release of that document, that guide. And yeah, the first thing I thought is, well, this is going to make the runZero people very happy, right? Because it'll help you with a lot of this. But it was all good advice. It was all very good advice, which is why we covered it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the last type of device I was going to show quickly is IoT. This is an IP camera, only discovered by runZero. But again, as you can see, the level of details is the same across all of them. And being able to see all of the data in one place instead of having to manage 4-5 different platforms is very important. We've heard a lot of customers, say, okay, I'm going to use this OT platform for my OT devices, but then I'm going to look at this other platform for all of my managed endpoints. But what about cloud? What about external? So being able to consolidate all of those data points is very important. In deployment is very straightforward. We offer 2 deployment models. You can use our SaaS version, or if you want the data to be locally in your environment, we offer an on-prem, which we call self-hosted. And we have a lot of customers in Australia actually that are using runZero on-prem. So that's an important distinction that we offer for customers that want to keep the data locally in their environment.
Yeah, I mean, so that's for the console side of things. And then, of course, you want to probably deploy this, depending on the size and architecture of your network, you sort of figure out where to put the scanners. If you're doing passive, you figure out where you're going to need a span port and, whatnot. So that's basically...
Spot on. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But the scan is very lightweight. It's not like you need mega hardware to run it.
Absolutely.
Pointing out.
Yeah.
I think you could run it on a Raspberry Pi, can't you?
I was just going to say that. Yeah, exactly. It's very portable. You could run it on a laptop. You can run it on a Raspberry Pi. It doesn't take a lot of resources. And obviously, as we said, no need for credentials and The passive and the active can actually be spun up on the same platform because it's the same binary. So it's super highly portable. Regarding the attack surface visibility, I just wanted to kind of point out one of our customers here in the US is the North Carolina State K-12 district, which is a public school in the US that serves from kindergarten all the way to 12th grade. And as you can imagine, a school has a very evolving, changing attack surface. And their big problem was lack of visibility in a very large environment. We're talking 1.3 million devices that are across IT, which is, faculty members have laptops, but also OT devices, HVAC systems that they're running, and IoT. They have card readers. They also have audiovisual systems in their classrooms, and they're spread across hundreds of schools. So they didn't have a statewide platform, and each school were running their own thing. They looked at runZero, they deployed the platform, and they were up and running in a matter of hours. And after 3 months, the whole platform was rolled statewide across hundreds of schools. So they were able to get that unified visibility, but we also uncovered a lot of variety of exposures, including unknown devices they didn't know about, again, as we talked about, that were lurking on the network, and a bunch of endpoints that were not managed by their endpoint protection tool, and just to name a few.
Well, I mean, you're talking about, this is very much core sort of asset discovery stuff, right? Which is finding those unmanaged devices, finding stuff you didn't know was there. But I guess the biggest change to runZero over the last year or so has been now you are doing, vulnerability scanning as well of those devices. So it's one thing to say, well, there's this weird device over here. It's not managed. The CMDB doesn't know about it. Like none of our other IT tools know about it. I mean, that's something you want to know, right? That's a problem.
Absolutely.
But what you really want to know is here's an unmanaged device, or even a managed device as well, that is reachable from the scanner, which contains this exploitable vulnerability, right? So this is the new thing that you're doing now, is you're really turning this thing into an extremely powerful network vulnerability scanner.
Exactly. And thank you for that. That's a perfect segue for us to talk about the exposure detection that runZero does. And because we have that in-depth visibility, what we've seen is that a lot of traditional tools, they rely on looking at vulnerabilities and exposure, which is, for example, hey, here are a list of older software versions running in your environment without any relevant context. And what ends up happening is customers complain because they have a massive list of vulnerabilities and then a laundry list of CVEs, and they have no context. And the expectation is go ahead and remediate all of those or patch all of those software based on just CVSS score, instead of finding real-time exposures, such as, for example, unmanaged security appliance that is exposed on the internet. And what I'm showing here on the screen is our risk management dashboard, which consolidates all of the data that runZero collects about your attack surface and answers the question of what should I concerned about? What should I be concerned about? What should I prioritize? All in one place. And you can think of it as like your centralized hub for taking action on risk. And the first thing I wanted to point out, Patrick, is on the top left here, you'll notice the latest rapid response. This is showing you essentially emerging threats or zero-day vulnerabilities or high-risk configurations that your assets might be impacted about. So you wake up in the morning, you grab your cup of coffee, and the first order of business is, am I impacted by this thing that Patrick is talking about on Risky Biz? And
I mean, it's insane, to be honest. It's insane that the incumbents haven't really done this well, like in the vulnerability management space, right? Because so often, I'll wake up and go in and check the news headlines in the morning when we're preparing the podcast. And like a recent example is this SharePoint 0 day that was getting people owned. You know what I mean? Like that's the sort of thing that people need to know about. And unless they're paying attention to the news headlines or whatever, like they might not necessarily know, or they might find out just a little bit too late that this is something that's like a 5-alarm fire that they need to drop everything and go do this. I remember when you guys were first kicking around the idea of doing this was a couple of years ago now, and it's great to see it in production because yes, sometimes people just need to be told, okay, you got a bunch of critical stuff, but this one is burning the internet down right now. You got to get on top of this right now. And it's, as I say, it's incredible that the incumbents haven't really done a good job of doing that previously.
And at that point, Patrick, like there was no patch, there was no fix, there was no remediation, no resolution in place. What you need to understand is zero-day vulnerability happened on the next hour. Is do I have an asset or service or a software that is running that component? An example that you see here is literally something that came out today that is all over the news and is a critical vulnerability. So you need an immediate response here. Like time is of the essence. And there is no manual searches in runZero. You don't have to go into the inventory and search if you're running that. There is no need to rescan because we're not doing signature-based vuln scanning. And you have the data at your fingertips.
Yeah, so basically you come in and it says, this bug is burning the internet down and it applies to you in these places. Go fix.
Yep, exactly. And the point you mentioned earlier with the incumbent is we heard a lot of customers say, like, they will go, there's a zero-day vulnerability. They will go into their traditional vuln management, traditional tool, and then the vendor will say, okay, we need to release a signature. They have to wait for that signature to be available, download it, rescan the whole environment with that signature. And depending on how big the environment is, it could take days, it could take weeks. And in the meantime, you're fully exposed. Like your assets are getting exploited. So
yeah,
it's
whereas
very important.
this way, because you've got all of that inventory data, you can know very quickly whether or not a certain, because you know the versions, you know whatever everything's running, right? So you know immediately. You can just scan locally the data in the console, in the background, and say, oh, okay, here it is.
Yep, exactly. And funny enough, you mentioned the Microsoft SharePoint server example. We've just released the ability to look at the latest rapid response in your email, in your inbox, without having to go to the console. And it tells you if you're impacted by the recent vulnerability, what is it, how many assets do you have, and a relevant blog post that kind of goes into details, in more details than what we're sending you in the email. So again, time is of the essence. You don't have to go to the console or rescan it. It sends it to you there with a proactive approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a service that people would actually pay quite a lot of money for, right? So it's kind of funny just being able to do that automatically. Just speaking of, I've got a couple of questions around the incumbents, right? So, like, what is the major, I mean, you've spoken about one of the major differences between, runZero's approach to doing this sort of vuln scanning and the incumbents. Like, what are some of the other differences? Because there would be people listening saying, I've got Nessus, I've got Qualys, I've got Nexpose. Like, what's the difference? Like, why do I need this? What's your answer there?
Yeah, so the first thing is going to be around the visibility. We showed the example right there of, the traditional vuln management discovering the asset and then giving you a completely misfingerprinted or inaccurate fingerprinting. So if you don't have that context to start with, it's very difficult to say this OT device has a vulnerability that came out, but your traditional vuln management is telling you it's a Linux. So the visibility piece is the first thing. And the second one is, what about unmanaged devices? And devices that cannot be managed. And typically, your traditional vuln management is going to rely on agent or authentication to those devices. And on that note, actually, I recently came across, and HD did some research on this. Last year's Mandiant M-Trends report showed, the top incident response investigation 2024, and they found that the top four exposures that were happening were actually devices that were placed at the edge of the network, and some of them were unmanaged. So those are things like Palo Alto with the Global Protect, Ivanti, Fortinet with their FortiClient, endpoint management server. And a lot of security vendors are not telling you about those because they're either unmanaged or some of them you can't even authenticate into, like a Sonic wall. So if they're exposed to the internet...
But are they not doing unauthenticated scans, like, of this stuff, like, at the perimeter? Because they used to, like, a million years ago, this is how these products worked. Are they not doing that anymore?
Well, if they can authenticate to, that's one thing. But if they cannot authenticate to, no, they're not going to be able to tell you about it. And if they authenticate into, it's more signature-based. So now they're not going to be telling you, like, a zero-day vulnerability that came out because they're relying on signatures, which, as we talked about, will take a lot of time.
So they're not doing unauthenticated scanning at all these days?
They are doing unauthenticated, but it's very poor, it's very weak, and the data that you get out of it... Okay, so it's just bad.
Like they've let their unauthenticated scanning atrophy. Like that makes sense to me. I mean, I remember it was like about a year and a half ago now, I saw HD, founder of runZero, do a presentation all about like how bad vuln scanners have got. It was actually quite funny. He was showing and I'm sure you've seen the talk a million times, but he showed screen captures between, some of these products like taken 20 years apart, and they basically looked identical. It was a funny talk. It was actually funny, like a what are we even doing here kind of talk. But no, that makes sense. That absolutely makes sense. And so my other question, right, is like, you talked about how you've got context, how you can prioritize. Like, okay, that sounds nice, but how are you actually making those decisions on how to prioritize vulnerabilities that turn up in a runZero scan?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I was gonna talk about that actually in a second, Patrick. I was gonna show some of the exposure detection that we do.
Okay, I'll
And I
stop
think
derailing you.
no,
You go. All
that's great.
right.
These are great questions, and I think very relevant. Honestly, a lot of our customers ask those same questions as well. But yeah, from a prioritization perspective, like this is some of the exposures that runZero does that are not, CVE based. So you'll find different categories that we're showing here. And these are not CVE based vulnerabilities or exposures that exist because attackers, they don't care about those. They look for any weakness that exists in your attack surface. And the couple of things that I wanted to show here are, for example, internet exposures. So those are going to be things like, hey, we're highlighting internal assets that are unintentionally exposed to the public internet, and as well as things like, certificate based. And this encompasses runZero's own proprietary inside out attack surface management capability. And I remember Patrick HD talked to you about this before, where we essentially have this very accurate device fingerprints of internal assets, things like TLS certificates, SSH host keys. And while we have that internal baseline, we're actually correlating that with externally collected metadata. So what ends up happening is we'll tell you, hey, we found this specific SSH private key that is widely shared on the public internet. So that is the private key, and these are all of the hosts that are publicly facing on the port that are using that same private key, because people are not rotating those keys and they get cloned and redeployed from an image. So again, this is not a vulnerability that is CVE based, and we're actually giving you also the relevant remediation, but also telling you, hey, this is the correct severity for that specific exposure.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And then some of the other thing, if I switch here to another organization, are tracking vulnerabilities that are, RCE or KEV that are natively scanned by runZero's own vulnerability scanner. And we're ingesting also vulnerabilities from third-party integrations. So if you see here, the sources column will essentially tell you how the vulnerability was ingested into runZero. And if I pick up specifically one here, which is a vuln that we're essentially telling you additional details that we've collected from AI and other sources to provide vulnerability enrichment. And this is actually a new feature within the platform. And we're giving you a lot of details, such as, what's the severity, what's the exploitation status, when was it first seen, but also additional details such as, hey, this is the exact nuclei target that we used to find that vulnerability and the response that we got. And this is a hint for what's coming next. We'll talk about that in more details. But the vuln enrichment also will tell you things like, hey, this is the intelligence that we gathered from known exploitation, but also EPSS, vuln check, sysakev, and then additional metadata, and finally online references. So this enrichment will propagate across vulnerabilities that were either discovered by runZero or our third-party vuln management scanner. I'm very, very excited for customers to start using this because I think it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, so let's talk about Nuclei, right? Which is how you're doing a lot of this. This is an open source vuln scanning project, right?
That is correct. Yep. You saw a sneak peek here, and we started collaborating with the folks at Nuclei, where we are detecting exposures, and those could be, vulnerability misconfigurations using an embedded version of the Nuclei vuln scanner. And one important thing I want to note here is about the safety and the speed. So the runZero team has spent month and month analyzing, the Nuclei code base and inspected the different templates for the best way to leverage Nuclei safely without increasing the amount of time that we take to, discover, fingerprint, and find the exposures. And only once runZero scans an IP and identifies and fingerprints the service, that's when we're going to match the relevant Nuclei template. If runZero doesn't discover it and fingerprint it, we're not going to run the Nuclei check. So that allows us to minimize the negative impact instead of, running Nuclei templates blankly on every system, especially fragile ones.
Yeah, okay. Makes a lot of sense. And just to be clear too, so when we're talking about rapid response, like that's when you can, because you have the inventory data, you might know, okay, well, there's an ODay in SharePoint. We know SharePoint's here, here, and here. So it's not going out and having to scan for stuff. But Nuclei is more of a signature-based scan. So what happens is the asset management platform identifies something that says it's this, it's because it's got this kernel or sets these, IP flags or whatever. And then you match it to a template and then you go scan it. So it's sort of both,
That is
right?
correct. Yeah, that is correct.
Yeah. Okay.
And we're doing things like default credentials. So that was kind of the first iteration with Nuclei, where we're telling you if we found, any HTTP service that is running a default cred. You find a few examples here of Crush FTP that are either using anonymous login or default credentials. But you're right, there is also the actual vuln scanning that Nuclei does. An example would be something like this Langflow AI, where we've used the embedded Nuclei agent to go and actually scan it.
Yep, got it. Makes sense. Now, when it comes to just again going back to prioritization, right? So we got these score numbers here. Like that's the CVSS base score.
Right.
How are you then prioritizing? Well, okay, you've got a CVSS 10 here, but it's not reachable from the internet. Like, does that factor into how you prioritize stuff in the console as well, in terms of context?
Yes.
Or yeah.
And this is where the prioritization piece comes into mind. Is being able to take into consideration a lot of data points, such as I want to be able to set, the example that I'm showing here is kind of the criticality of the asset. So being able to go in and understand, hey, how important is that asset to the overall business, but also being able to see the risk severity, which is, as you said, Patrick, coming from something like a CVSS. We also will look at offering customers the ability to set tags on an asset, which is very important to be able to say, where is this asset located? Is it externally facing? Is it internally facing? Is it part of a lab? That's another thing that we offer. And then finally, obviously, metadata that are coming from third-party integrations that help us, such as ownership tracking. So that's something that runZero offers. These are all things that you can take into consideration to understand, how critical is this asset, and then also see the severity of a vulnerability.
How are you able to measure like business criticality, right, automatically? Or is that something that it relies on manual tagging?
So we offer both programmatically, looking at all of the different components and metadata that comes in an asset. So I can say, hey, I know that this network or the subnet has all of my line of business application. So if it's part of that IP address range, I want to set the criticality for the asset. So you can set that based on rules programmatically. But also, obviously, APIs, you can set a lot of these programmatically as well. So we offer both manual, but a lot of our customers, they take a lot of the metadata and set it programmatically.
And I'm guessing the ownership information, you're pulling that out of directories, right?
Yes, that is correct. Both of them, actually. You can set ownership data locally within runZero, but we also integrate with identity providers, so we can get that data point from Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, Google Workspace, and then attach that to an asset. Absolutely.
Now, what sort of size organizations are using runZero now for vuln scanning? Because I can imagine like medium-sized network here and like smaller, large network. I'm thinking like this is heaven, right? Like, do you have some mega orgs using it, right? Because I'm just curious how it goes when you start plugging in like scanners everywhere across different branch offices in different regions, right? And then start pulling all that back together. Are there big orgs using this?
Yeah, absolutely. It's honestly from mom and pop shop all the way to Fortune 50, Patrick, that are using, because as you mentioned earlier in the podcast, like we started with the visibility piece. So a lot of customers were looking at runZero to kind of give us that baseline of what are all of the assets that exist in the environment. But with the addition of the vault scanning and exposure management, we have a lot of customers that are using runZero in over 1 million assets in an environment, especially with a lot of environments that are completely, essentially all over the world, multinational. And one of them is an energy company that actually used the default credentials, and they ran the default creds with Nuclei in their US subsidiary and immediately found like over 50 assets that were running default credentials. So they had to make a kind of a security decision to run the default creds across all of the sites. So we have different industries as well, across healthcare, you have enterprises, but also customers such as universities. It's all over the board, honestly.
And now the spicy question, which is, what are you displacing? with this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as you can see here, runZero can be plugged in so many different use cases. What typically we displace are going to be attack surface management platform, or CASM tools as they call them. Those are one, and then obviously now we're getting more and more into vulnerability management. So displacing a lot of the traditional vul management. It obviously would depends a lot also on what are the use cases the customer is using vul management for. Because as we talked about, we don't offer, authenticated scans. We don't do patching as well within the platform. But in some cases, we are replacing vul management, just making sure we understand what are the use cases there.
Well, I'd imagine too, the stuff that you're not replacing are going to be the agent-based, vuln scanning tools that sit on endpoints, right? And there's, everybody's got them. So that's what I find really interesting about this is like, that's kind of a solved problem. There's 3 companies that do it. I'm thinking you've got Nexpose, Qualys, and Tenable for those endpoint agent scans. But I guess what's interesting is they have neglected the network side. And then now you're coming in and sort of solving that problem. I mean, that's really where we are here, right?
Right. The unmanaged, the devices that you cannot manage. And the other use case we've seen quite a lot happening, Patrick, is essentially using an EDR platform that has a vuln management component and using that with runZero and displacing traditional vulnerability management. Because, your CrowdStrike, your Sentinel-1, they'll take care of all the endpoints, things they can manage. runZero takes care of everything else. So that's something we're seeing more and more of.
Yeah, so the EDR companies now, they're offering it. It's usually an additional cost, isn't it? So they're like, well, we can do the vulnerability scanning stuff on the local host as well. But I guess they don't have the vuln management side of it at this pretty console. So yeah, exactly. I guess that would make sense is if you can get that information from EDR for the endpoints and then combine it with this, you do not need to use one of the incumbent vulnerability management companies' platforms anymore. Right. Okay, so that explains how you're displacing them. Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So I guess just to summarize really quickly here, Patrick. So runZero is kind of the first step in your security risk management. It's the first solution that you go to understand what exists in your environment, what are the risks associated with your asset, what's the exposure level, and if you don't know what you have, how can you protect it? So this is a very, very important platform for any security use case, even IT use cases that we've seen across the board. And we offer a free trial that essentially gives you access to the platform. And after that, it turns into a community edition, which is free for life for a limited number of assets, for 100 assets.
Okay. All right. Ali Cheikh, great to see you again. We did a demo of runZero a couple of years ago. So this is where we're replacing that demo with this demo. It's really great to see where it's coming. If I put on my industry analyst hat for a moment, I think this is going to go stonks, as they say. I think this is going to go great because vulnerability management, such a big market, and yeah, the tools have fallen behind, and this definitely hasn't. So, very, very cool, and great to see you again. And I look forward to checking in with you in another couple of years to see where we're at.
Same here. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it.